What I'm about to tell you was classified for 15 years. Even now, some details remain buried in Pentagon vaults that will never see daylight. My name is Colonel James Iron Mitchell. You're watching Razor Edge. Before we dive into this classified operation, I need to ask you something important. If these untold military stories resonate with you, consider subscribing to Razor Edge and hitting that notification bell. It ensures you never miss our exclusive military narratives, and it truly helps us continue honoring these heroes' stories. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in sub-level 3 of the Pentagon, casting harsh shadows across the faces of 12 men who weren't supposed to exist. Colonel Marcus "Reaper" Blackwood adjusted his dress blues as he walked down the corridor marked only with numbers that meant nothing to outsiders. 22 years of Delta Force operations had taught him to read rooms before entering them, but nothing had prepared him for what waited behind door 3847. The message had been simple. Report to briefing room 3847 at 0800 hours. Classification level, above top secret. Come alone. It was signed with a code name Blackwood hadn't seen in 5 years. Prometheus. That name belonged to a man who officially died in Afghanistan, but who Blackwood knew was very much alive and operating in the shadows of military intelligence. But what he discovered in that briefing room would change everything he believed about loyalty and duty. The room was smaller than most Pentagon briefing spaces, designed for conversations that couldn't happen in larger venues. 11 other Delta Force commanders sat around an oval table, their faces grim with the weight of whatever classified information had brought them here. At the head of the table stood a man Blackwood recognized immediately, General Harrison "Titan" Crawford, a legend in special operations circles who had supposedly retired 3 years ago. "Gentlemen," Crawford's voice carried the authority of someone who had sent men into impossible situations and brought them home alive. "What we discuss in this room today will never be recorded, never be acknowledged, and never be repeated outside these walls. Are we clear?" 12 voices responded in unison. "Clear, sir." Crawford activated a device that Blackwood recognized as a military-grade signal jammer. Every electronic device in the room was now useless. "The situation we face threatens the very foundation of American military readiness. Our current commander-in-chief has announced his intention to cut military spending by 60% over the next 18 months. The number hit the room like a physical blow. 60% meant the end of most special operations programs, the dissolution of entire units, and the abandonment of strategic positions worldwide that had taken decades to establish. How could a single decision destroy everything they had built in the war on terror? "The President plans to withdraw from 7 active theaters of operation, cancel 43 defense contracts worth over $200 billion, and reduce special operations forces by 75%, Crawford continued, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was revealing. He believes that America's military presence around the world is, and I quote, "an expensive mistake that serves corporate interests rather than national security." Colonel Blackwood felt his stomach tighten. He had served in 4 of those theaters personally, had lost good men establishing footholds that this president wanted to abandon. But something about Crawford's tone suggested this briefing wasn't just about sharing bad news. "Sir," Colonel Peters from 2nd Squadron spoke up, "with respect, policy decisions are made by civilian leadership. That's how the system works." Crawford's smile was cold as winter in Kandahar. "The system, Colonel, assumes that civilian leadership acts in America's best interests. What if that assumption is wrong?" The question hung in the air like smoke from an IED explosion, toxic and impossible to ignore. Blackwood had heard whispers in the special operations community about the president's anti-war stance, but this felt different. This felt like the beginning of something that would cross lines that shouldn't be crossed. But the next words out of Crawford's mouth would shatter every assumption about the limits of military loyalty. "Operation Constitutional Reset has been approved by a coalition of defense contractors, Pentagon officials, and military leaders who understand what's at stake," Crawford announced, pressing a button that lowered a projection screen. "The objective is simple: remove the current president from power before he can implement policies that will cripple American military capabilities for a generation." The room fell silent except for the hum of the signal jammer. Blackwood felt his training kick in, the same mental discipline that had kept him alive through dozens of operations behind enemy lines. But this wasn't enemy territory. This was the Pentagon, and the man at the front of the room was talking about overthrowing the government they had all sworn to protect. "Sir," Blackwood found his voice, though it sounded strange to his own ears. "Are you talking about a military coup?" Crawford's eyes fixed on Blackwood with laser intensity. "I'm talking about saving the United States military from a president who would rather see America defenseless than profitable. The operation has 3 phases: destabilization, isolation, and neutralization." The clinical language couldn't hide what Crawford was really saying. They were planning to kill the President of the United States. How many other rooms in the Pentagon were having this same conversation right now? Phase 1 involves psychological operations designed to undermine public confidence in the president's mental stability, Crawford continued, as if he were briefing a standard military operation. Phase 2 requires isolating him from loyal security personnel through strategic placement of our assets within the Secret Service. Phase 3. Crawford paused, letting the implications settle over the room like a burial shroud. Colonel Martinez from 3rd Squadron leaned forward. "General, what you're describing is treason." "What I'm describing," Crawford replied without missing a beat, "is preventing the systematic destruction of American military power by a president who has never served a day in uniform and doesn't understand the realities of global warfare. We have assets in place within the Secret Service, cooperation agreements with major defense contractors, and support from key Pentagon officials." Blackwood's mind raced through the implications. If Crawford was telling the truth, this conspiracy reached into the highest levels of government and the military-industrial complex. The scope was staggering, but the moral implications were even worse. But what Crawford revealed next would prove that the conspiracy was already in motion. "Gentlemen, this is not a theoretical discussion. Phase 1 operations began 72 hours ago. Psychological profiles of the president are being leaked to sympathetic media contacts, and our embedded assets in the Secret Service have begun mapping his security protocols." Crawford's voice carried the confidence of someone who had already committed to an irreversible course of action. The revelation hit Blackwood like incoming artillery. This wasn't a planning session. It was a recruitment meeting. The conspiracy was already operational, and they were being asked to join something that was already happening. "Each of you commands elite units with specialized capabilities that would be invaluable to constitutional reset," Crawford continued. "Your participation is not mandatory, but your silence is. You have 72 hours to decide whether you're part of the solution or part of the problem." The threat was clear, without being explicitly stated. Join the conspiracy or become a target of it. Colonel Blackwood stared at the projection screen, which now displayed organizational charts showing the structure of the conspiracy. Names he recognized from the highest levels of military command were connected by lines that traced a web of treason reaching into every branch of the armed forces. But one name on that chart would haunt him for the rest of his life. His own. "Your unit designations and current operational capabilities are already integrated into our planning," Crawford said, his eyes moving from face to face around the table. "Colonel Blackwood, your expertise in psychological operations and urban infiltration makes you particularly valuable for Phase 2 operations." The words hit Blackwood like a sniper's bullet. They hadn't just planned this conspiracy, they had planned his participation in it. His skills, his unit, his men were already factored into an operation designed to murder the President of the United States. "Sir," Blackwood said carefully, "I need time to process this information." "Of course," Crawford replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. 72 hours, as I mentioned, but understand that time is not our ally. The President plans to announce the military cuts in a joint session of Congress next week. If we're going to act, it has to be before that announcement becomes public policy. The timeline was impossibly tight, but Blackwood realized that was intentional. 72 hours wasn't enough time to think through the moral implications, to seek counsel, or to find alternatives. It was just enough time to choose sides. As the meeting concluded and the other commanders filed out, Blackwood remained seated, staring at the organizational chart that included his name among the conspirators. 22 years of military service had prepared him for many impossible decisions, but never one that would force him to choose between his loyalty to the military and his oath to defend the Constitution. But as he walked out of that briefing room, Colonel Marcus Blackwood had no idea that his decision would determine not just his own fate, but the fate of American democracy itself. The 72-hour countdown had begun, and somewhere in Washington, D.C., the President of the United States was going about his daily routine, completely unaware that some of America's most elite soldiers were planning his assassination. The drive from the Pentagon to Fort Bragg usually took Colonel Blackwood 4 hours. That night, it took him 6. He pulled over 3 times, each time staring at his phone, wondering if he should call someone, anyone, who could help him make sense of what he had just witnessed. But who do you call when the conspiracy reaches the highest levels of military command? The weight of General Crawford's words pressed down on him like the North Carolina humidity that greeted him as he stepped out of his vehicle at 0347 hours. 72 hours to decide whether to participate in the assassination of the President of the United States. 72 hours to choose between everything he had believed about military loyalty and everything he had sworn to defend about the Constitution. But what he discovered when he reached his quarters would prove that the choice might already be out of his hands. A manila envelope sat on his desk, unmarked except for a small symbol in the corner, the same Prometheus designation that had summoned him to the Pentagon. Inside, Blackwood found detailed dossiers on every member of his unit, complete with psychological profiles, family information, and what appeared to be recruitment assessments. The message was clear. Constitutional Reset wasn't just planning to use him. They were planning to use his men. Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, his senior NCO, and a man who had saved Blackwood's life twice in Afghanistan, was marked as high-value asset, demolitions expertise. Staff Sergeant Chen, barely 25 years old with a wife and newborn daughter, was labeled recruitment priority, electronic warfare specialist. Every soldier under Blackwood's command had been evaluated for their potential contribution to a conspiracy they knew nothing about. But the file that made his blood run cold was marked with his own name and a single word: activated. According to the documents, Blackwood's participation wasn't optional. His psychological profile, compiled over months of surveillance, concluded that his deep loyalty to military institution and history of following orders in morally ambiguous situations made him an ideal candidate for recruitment. The conspiracy had been studying him, manipulating him, preparing him for this moment. How long had they been watching him? How many of his recent assignments had been tests? The secure phone on his desk rang at exactly 0400 hours. The voice on the other end was electronically distorted, but the message was crystal clear. "Colonel, your unit has been selected for immediate deployment. Report to Briefing Room C at 0600 hours for mission parameters. Classification, Constitutional Reset." The line went dead before Blackwood could respond. In 2 hours, he would have to face his men and brief them on a mission that would make them all traitors to the country they had sworn to protect. Unless he found another way. But as he reached for his secure communication device to contact higher command, he realized the conspiracy's reach was even deeper than he had imagined. The device was dead. Not malfunctioning, completely disabled. Someone with access to military-grade electronic warfare capabilities had remotely shut down his ability to communicate with anyone outside the conspiracy's network. He was isolated, cut off from any chain of command that might help him resist what was happening. A soft knock on his door made him freeze. At 0415 hours, no one should be moving through the barracks except security personnel. Blackwood drew his sidearm and approached the door with the caution that had kept him alive through dozens of operations in hostile territory. "Sir?" The voice belonged to Sergeant Rodriguez. "We need to talk." Blackwood opened the door to find his senior NCO standing in the hallway, fully dressed despite the early hour. Rodriguez's expression was grim, and his eyes held the same haunted look Blackwood had seen in the Pentagon briefing room. "They got to you too," Rodriguez said. It wasn't a question. "How long have you known?" Blackwood asked, stepping aside to let Rodriguez enter his quarters. 3 days. Got a visit from someone claiming to be Pentagon intelligence. showed me classified documents about the president's military cuts, asked me about unit loyalty, wanted to know if I thought you could be trusted with sensitive operations. Rodriguez's voice carried the weight of a man who had realized he was being recruited for something terrible. The revelation hit Blackwood like incoming mortar fire. The conspiracy hadn't just been watching him. They had been testing his unit's loyalty through his own NCO. Rodriguez, a man Blackwood trusted with his life, had been approached to evaluate his commander's suitability for treason. But what Rodriguez said next would prove that the conspiracy's infiltration was even more complete than either of them realized. "Sir, they didn't just approach me. They've been talking to Chen, Martinez, and Williams. Different people, different approaches, but the same basic message. The president is a threat to national security, and loyal soldiers might need to take action." Rodriguez's hands clenched into fists. "They're recruiting the entire unit, one soldier at a time." Blackwood felt the walls closing in around him. Constitutional reset wasn't just a conspiracy among senior officers. It was a systematic infiltration of the military at every level. They were building an army within the army, using the same recruitment techniques that special operations use to build networks in foreign countries. "Did anyone accept?" Blackwood asked, though he dreaded the answer. Chen's been asking questions about the president's military experience. Williams mentioned something about civilian leadership, not understanding warfare. Martinez, Rodriguez paused, his expression darkening. "Martinez asked me yesterday if I thought orders from Washington were always legitimate." The implications were staggering. Blackwood's own unit, men he had trained and led through combat operations, were being systematically turned against the government they had sworn to protect. The conspiracy wasn't just planning to use existing military assets. They were creating new ones through careful psychological manipulation. But the sound of vehicles approaching the barracks would prove that their time for discussion was running out. "Multiple vehicles, military pattern," Rodriguez said, moving to the window with the instincts of a combat veteran. "Black SUVs, no unit markings. This isn't a standard military convoy." Blackwood joined him at the window and counted 6 vehicles moving through the base with the precision of a planned operation. These weren't random visitors. This was constitutional reset coming to collect their assets. "Sir, we've got maybe 10 minutes before they reach this building," Rodriguez said. "What are your orders?" The question hung in the air between them. Rodriguez was asking him to choose sides, to decide whether they would resist the conspiracy or become part of it. But Blackwood realized that the choice might already be made for them. His secure communication was disabled. His unit was being recruited individually. Unknown operatives were moving through the base with obvious authority. Constitutional reset had isolated him from any support network that might help him resist their recruitment. But as the vehicles drew closer, Colonel Blackwood made a decision that would define the rest of his military career. "Rodriguez, I need you to do something that might get us both court-martialed," Blackwood said, moving to his personal safe and retrieving a device he had hoped never to use. "I'm going to activate an emergency protocol that will send a message outside normal military channels." The device was a last-resort communication tool, designed for use when normal command structures had been compromised. Activating it would send an encrypted message to a civilian intelligence contact, bypassing military communication entirely. It would also mark him as someone who no longer trusted his own chain of command. "Sir, if you use that device, there's no going back," Rodriguez warned. "They'll know you're not cooperating." "They already know," Blackwood replied, beginning the activation sequence. "The question is whether we're going to let them turn us into traitors or whether we're going to find a way to stop this." But before he could complete the activation, the lights in his quarters went out, plunging the room into darkness. Emergency lighting kicked in a moment later, bathing everything in an eerie red glow that made the situation feel even more surreal. The power outage wasn't accidental. Constitutional reset was demonstrating their control over base infrastructure, showing Blackwood that resistance was futile. They could cut his communications, disable his equipment, and isolate him from any potential allies. A voice over the base public address system confirmed his worst fears. "All personnel report to designated assembly areas immediately. This is not a drill. Repeat, all personnel report to designated assembly areas immediately." The announcement was being made under the authority of base command, but Blackwood recognized the voice. It belonged to Colonel Peters, one of the commanders from the Pentagon briefing room. Constitutional reset wasn't just infiltrating Fort Bragg, they were taking control of it. "Sir," Rodriguez said, his voice tight with tension, "what do we do?" Blackwood looked at the emergency communication device in his hands, then at the red emergency lighting that made everything look like a scene from hell. Outside, he could hear the sound of soldiers moving through the barracks, following orders from commanders who were part of a conspiracy to overthrow the government. In 67 hours, constitutional reset would move to phase 2 of their operation. In 67 hours, they would begin the final preparations to assassinate the President of the United States. And unless Blackwood found a way to stop them, his own unit would be part of that assassination. But first, he had to survive the next 67 hours without becoming a casualty of his own resistance. The footsteps in the hallway were getting closer, and Colonel Marcus Blackwood realized that his war for the soul of American democracy was about to begin in the place he had least expected it, among the soldiers he had sworn to lead and protect. The assembly area at Fort Bragg looked like every other military formation Blackwood had attended in 22 years of service, except for one crucial detail. The soldiers giving orders weren't the usual base command structure. Colonel Peters stood at the podium where the base commander should have been, flanked by men in civilian clothes who carried themselves with the unmistakable bearing of intelligence operatives. Blackwood and Rodriguez took their positions in the formation, surrounded by 300 soldiers who had no idea they were about to become unwitting participants in a conspiracy against their own government. The irony wasn't lost on Blackwood. They were using military discipline and chain of command to organize a rebellion against military discipline and chain of command. But what Colonel Peters announced would reveal just how deep the conspiracy's roots had grown. "Gentlemen, you are now part of Operation Righteous Shield," Peters began, his voice carrying across the assembly area with practiced authority. "Intelligence has confirmed that hostile foreign elements have compromised the highest levels of civilian government. Your mission is to protect American national security interests through enhanced security protocols and specialized operations." The lie was masterfully crafted. By framing the conspiracy as a counterintelligence operation against foreign threats, Peters was giving the soldiers a patriotic justification for what they were about to be asked to do. Constitutional reset wasn't overthrowing the government. They were protecting it from foreign infiltration. Blackwood felt sick as he watched 300 good soldiers absorb the deception. These men had served their country with honor, and now they were being manipulated into betraying everything they had fought to defend. But the next phase of Peters' briefing would show him just how sophisticated the conspiracy's planning had become. "Each unit will receive specialized assignments based on your unique capabilities," Peters continued. "Delta Force units will focus on high-value target protection and urban operations. Intelligence specialists will monitor communications for signs of foreign interference. Support personnel will maintain operational security for all enhanced activities." The language was deliberately vague, but Blackwood understood the real meaning. Delta Force would handle the assassination. Intelligence specialists would monitor anyone who might discover the plot. Support personnel would help cover up the evidence afterward. A man in civilian clothes stepped forward to address the formation. Blackwood recognized him immediately. Marcus Webb, a former CIA operative who had supposedly left government service 5 years ago to work for a private security contractor. His presence here confirmed that constitutional reset extended far beyond the military into the intelligence community and private sector. How many other former government officials were actually still working for the conspiracy? "Your operational security is paramount," Webb announced. "Any soldier who discusses these operations outside authorized channels will be considered a security risk and dealt with accordingly. Any soldier who refuses to participate in assigned operations will be transferred to non-essential duties pending security review." The threats were clear without being explicit. Cooperate or face consequences that could destroy a military career. Blackwood had seen similar tactics used in psychological operations against enemy forces, but never against American soldiers. "Unit commanders will report to Briefing Room C in 30 minutes for detailed mission assignments," Peters concluded. "Dismissed." As the formation broke up, Blackwood caught Rodriguez's eye and nodded toward the communications building. They needed to find a way to contact someone outside the conspiracy's network, but first they had to understand exactly what they were up against. But as they walked across the base, Blackwood noticed details that made his blood run cold. Security checkpoints had been established at key locations, manned by soldiers he didn't recognize. Communication antennas had been modified with equipment that looked like signal interception gear. Even the base's internet and phone systems showed signs of monitoring equipment that hadn't been there the day before. Constitutional Reset hadn't just infiltrated Fort Bragg. They had taken operational control of it in less than 12 hours. "Sir," Rodriguez whispered as they passed another unfamiliar security checkpoint. "Look at their unit patches." Blackwood glanced at the soldiers manning the checkpoint and felt his stomach drop. Their patches showed a unit designation he had never seen before. Special Security Detachment, with a symbol that matched the Prometheus marking from the Pentagon briefing room. These weren't regular Army soldiers. They were Constitutional Reset operatives wearing military uniforms. The conspiracy had brought in their own personnel to secure the base while they recruited or neutralized potential resistance. They were operating with the efficiency of a military coup, but with the cover of legitimate security operations. But what Blackwood discovered in the communications building would reveal the true scope of the conspiracy's reach. The building was supposed to be staffed by regular Army communications specialists, but every person Blackwood saw was unfamiliar. Worse, they were installing equipment that looked more like intelligence gathering gear than standard military communications equipment. "Colonel Blackwood," a voice called from behind him. He turned to see a young woman in civilian clothes approaching with a tablet in her hands. "I'm Sarah Mitchell from Pentagon Systems Integration. I need to brief you on your unit's new communication protocols." The name was obviously fake, but her security clearance credentials appeared genuine. She led Blackwood and Rodriguez to a small office that had been converted into what looked like a miniature intelligence operations center, complete with multiple computer screens showing real-time data feeds. "Your unit's communications are now being routed through enhanced security protocols," Mitchell explained, showing them a complex diagram on her tablet. "All messages will be encrypted and monitored for foreign interference patterns. Any suspicious communications will be flagged for immediate investigation." Blackwood realized what he was looking at. Constitutional Reset had created a comprehensive surveillance network that would monitor every communication going in or out of Fort Bragg. They would know immediately if anyone tried to contact outside authorities or resist their operations. But the most chilling revelation was yet to come. "Colonel, your unit has been selected for a special assignment," Mitchell continued, pulling up a new screen on her tablet. "You'll be working directly with Secret Service advance teams to enhance security protocols for upcoming presidential events." The words hit Blackwood like a sniper's bullet. Constitutional Reset wasn't just planning to assassinate the president. They were using his own unit to infiltrate the Secret Service security apparatus. They would have inside access to presidential protection protocols, schedules, and vulnerabilities. "When does this assignment begin?" Blackwood asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Immediately. You and your team will deploy to Washington, D.C. tonight to begin coordination with Secret Service personnel. Your contact will be Agent Thompson, who has been briefed on the enhanced security requirements." Blackwood's mind raced through the implications. Agent Thompson was probably another Constitutional Reset asset, planted within the Secret Service to facilitate the assassination. His unit would be used to gather intelligence on presidential security while believing they were protecting the president. But as Mitchell handed him the deployment orders, Blackwood noticed something that gave him the first glimmer of hope he had felt since leaving the Pentagon. The orders contained a small error, a misplaced comma in a security classification marking that violated standard military documentation protocols. It was the kind of mistake that only someone outside the military would make, suggesting that at least some of the conspiracy's operations were being run by civilians who didn't fully understand military procedures. If there were flaws in their operational security, there might be ways to exploit them. "Ma'am," Rodriguez interjected, "what about our current training schedule? We're supposed to begin advanced urban warfare exercises next week." Mitchell's response confirmed Blackwood's suspicions about the conspiracy's civilian leadership. "Those exercises have been canceled. Your new assignment takes priority over all previous commitments." No military planner would cancel advanced training exercises without replacement activities. The decision revealed that Constitutional Reset was being run by people who understood politics and intelligence operations, but not military readiness and training cycles. But before Blackwood could process this weakness further, an alarm began sounding throughout the base. "Security alert level orange," came the announcement over the base communication system. "All personnel remain in current locations pending security sweep. This is not a drill." Mitchell's expression shifted from professional courtesy to cold efficiency. "Colonel, it appears we have a security situation. I'll need you and your NCO to remain here while we resolve it." The security situation was obviously a cover for something else, but Blackwood couldn't tell if it was related to the conspiracy or if someone else on base had discovered what was happening. Either way, he and Rodriguez were now effectively under house arrest. Through the office window, Blackwood could see vehicles moving across the base with obvious urgency. Soldiers were being escorted to various buildings, but their body language suggested they were being detained rather than briefed. Constitutional Reset was rounding up anyone who might pose a threat to their operation. But the sound of helicopters approaching the base would prove that the conspiracy's reach extended far beyond Fort Bragg. "Those aren't Army helicopters," Rodriguez observed, listening to the distinctive sound of the rotors. "Wrong engine signature." Blackwood recognized the sound as well. Civilian helicopters, probably carrying more Constitutional Reset operatives or equipment. The conspiracy was bringing in additional resources to complete their takeover of the base and prepare for the next phase of their operation. "Colonel," Mitchell said, checking her phone, "I've just received word that your deployment to Washington has been moved up. You'll be leaving in 2 hours instead of tonight." The timeline acceleration meant something had changed. Either Constitutional Reset was ahead of schedule, or something had happened that required them to move faster than planned. Neither possibility was good news for the President of the United States. As Blackwood stared out the window at the helicopters landing on his base, he realized that he had less than 48 hours to find a way to stop a conspiracy that had infiltrated every level of military and civilian government. The President was scheduled to announce his military cuts in a joint session of Congress in 46 hours, and Constitutional Reset was clearly planning to act before that announcement. But first, Colonel Marcus Blackwood had to find a way to escape from his own base without being detected by a conspiracy that was monitoring his every move and communication. The war for American democracy was about to move to Washington, D.C., and unless he could find a way to warn someone, the President would never see it coming. The flight to Washington, D.C. should have taken 90 minutes. Instead, Blackwood found himself on a military transport that made 2 unscheduled stops, picked up passengers he didn't recognize, and landed at Andrews Air Force Base instead of the designated military airfield. Every deviation from standard protocol confirmed what he already knew. Constitutional Reset was operating outside normal military channels. Rodriguez sat across from him in the cargo hold, maintaining the stoic expression of a professional soldier, while his eyes communicated the same growing alarm that Blackwood felt. They were surrounded by 12 other soldiers from various units, all supposedly part of the enhanced Secret Service coordination, but none of whom Blackwood recognized despite his extensive contacts throughout special operations. But what he overheard during the flight would confirm his worst fears about the conspiracy's timeline. 2 seats ahead, a man in civilian clothes was speaking quietly into a satellite phone. The engine noise should have masked his conversation, but Blackwood's training in surveillance had taught him to read lips and pick up fragments of conversations in hostile environments. Phase 2. Initiation confirmed for tomorrow at 1400 hours, the man was saying. Secret Service penetration is complete. Presidential schedule has been modified to accommodate our requirements. Tomorrow at 1400 hours was exactly when the President was scheduled to arrive at the Capitol for his joint session address. Constitutional Reset wasn't planning to wait until after the speech. They were going to act during the President's arrival, when security protocols would be at their most complex and vulnerable. Blackwood had less than 18 hours to stop an assassination that was already in motion. But the conversation he overheard next would reveal just how thoroughly the conspiracy had infiltrated the government's highest levels. "Confirmation from Asset Nightingale that the Vice President is secured," the man continued. "Congressional leadership has been briefed on the transition protocols. Supreme Court Chief Justice is standing by for emergency swearing-in procedures." The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Constitutional Reset hadn't just planned to kill the President. They had arranged for a complete government transition that would appear legal and constitutional. The vice president, congressional leadership, and even the Supreme Court were either part of the conspiracy or being manipulated by it. This wasn't just an assassination plot. It was a complete coup d'etat disguised as a constitutional succession. Rodriguez caught Blackwood's eye and nodded slightly, indicating that he had heard the conversation as well. They were both thinking the same thing. Even if they could warn someone about the assassination attempt, who could they trust when the conspiracy reached into every branch of government? But as the transport began its descent toward Andrews Air Force Base, Blackwood realized that their situation was about to become even more dangerous. Colonel Blackwood, the man with the satellite phone, approached him as the aircraft touched down. I'm Agent Harrison, your liaison with the Secret Service advance team. We need to begin your briefing immediately. The name was obviously fake, but Harrison's credentials appeared genuine. More importantly, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who knew that resistance was futile. Constitutional reset had Blackwood exactly where they wanted him, isolated from his support network and surrounded by their operatives. Agent Harrison, Blackwood replied carefully, what's the timeline for our coordination with Secret Service personnel? We begin immediately. The President's security detail needs to be briefed on enhanced threat protocols before tomorrow's congressional address. Harrison's smile was cold and professional. Your expertise in urban operations will be particularly valuable. They were going to use Blackwood's own knowledge of tactical operations to plan the President's murder. The irony was sickening, but it also gave him an opportunity. If he was going to be briefed on the assassination plan, he might be able to find a way to disrupt it. But first, he had to survive the next few hours without revealing that he knew what constitutional reset was really planning. The ride from Andrews Air Force Base to downtown Washington took them through neighborhoods Blackwood knew well from previous security assignments. But tonight, he noticed details that made his blood run cold. Unmarked vehicles were positioned at key intersections. Communication vans were parked in locations that would provide surveillance coverage of major government buildings, and personnel who looked like private military contractors were visible in areas where they shouldn't be. Constitutional reset had turned Washington, D.C. into a military occupation zone, but they had done it so subtly that most people wouldn't notice until it was too late. How many other cities had they infiltrated while preparing for tomorrow's operation? The briefing location was a nondescript office building 6 blocks from the Capitol, the kind of place that housed dozens of government contractors and consulting firms. But the security measures Blackwood observed as they entered suggested this was no ordinary office space. Biometric scanners, signal jammers, and armed guards who moved with military precision, Constitutional Reset had established a command center in the heart of Washington, D.C., and they were operating with the confidence of people who knew they wouldn't be discovered or stopped. Colonel, welcome to the Enhanced Security Coordination Center, Harrison said as they entered an elevator that required both a key card and a biometric scan. Your briefing will cover presidential movement protocols, threat assessment procedures, and tactical response scenarios. The elevator descended 2 levels below ground, opening into a facility that looked like a smaller version of the Pentagon's Crisis Management Center. Multiple screens showed real-time surveillance feeds from around Washington, D.C. Communication stations were manned by operators who looked more like intelligence analysts than Secret Service agents, and tactical displays showed detailed maps of the Capitol building and surrounding area. But the sight that made Blackwood's stomach drop was a detailed scale model of the Capitol building's east entrance, complete with miniature figures representing security personnel and marked with red dots that could only indicate planned attack positions. They weren't just planning to assassinate the president. They were planning a military-style assault on the United States Capitol. Impressive, isn't it? Harrison said, noticing Blackwood's reaction to the tactical display. We've been planning this operation for 8 months. Every detail has been considered, every contingency prepared for. 8 months meant the conspiracy had begun long before the president announced his military cuts. Constitutional Reset wasn't reacting to policy they disagreed with. They had been planning to overthrow the government regardless of what the president did or didn't do. Agent Harrison, Rodriguez interjected, what's our specific role in tomorrow's operation? You'll be part of the inner security perimeter, Harrison replied, leading them to a detailed briefing area. Your unit's expertise in close-quarters combat and urban operations makes you ideal for neutralizing any unexpected resistance. The euphemism was chilling. Neutralizing unexpected resistance meant killing anyone who tried to protect the president or stop the assassination. Constitutional Reset was planning to use Blackwood's own men to murder Secret Service agents, Capitol Police, and anyone else who stood in their way. But as Harrison began the detailed tactical briefing, Blackwood noticed something that gave him hope, and a possible way to stop the conspiracy. The operation was incredibly complex, involving multiple moving parts, precise timing, and coordination between dozens of different elements. That complexity was both Constitutional Reset's strength and their weakness. If any single element failed or was disrupted, the entire operation could collapse. Phase 1 begins at 13:30 hours when the presidential motorcade departs the White House, Harrison explained, pointing to the tactical display. Our assets within the Secret Service will ensure that the route takes the president past 3 predetermined positions where our teams will be waiting. Blackwood memorized every detail of the route and the attack positions. If he could find a way to warn the real Secret Service, they could change the route and avoid the ambush entirely. Phase 2 initiates at 1400 hours when the president arrives at the Capitol, Harrison continued. Your team will be positioned here, here, and here, he said, marking positions on the scale model. When the signal is given, you'll neutralize the Secret Service detail and secure the target for final termination. The clinical language couldn't hide the reality of what Harrison was describing. They wanted Blackwood and his men to murder the president's bodyguards and hold him still while someone else pulled the trigger. But the next part of Harrison's briefing would reveal the most disturbing aspect of the entire conspiracy. Phase 3 begins immediately after termination, Harrison said, his voice taking on an almost reverent tone. The vice president will be sworn in as president within 2 hours. Congressional leadership will announce a state of emergency, and military commanders will implement enhanced security protocols to maintain order during the transition. Constitutional Reset had planned every detail of the post-assassination government. They knew exactly who would replace the president, how the transition would be justified to the public, and what emergency powers would be implemented to prevent any investigation or resistance. This wasn't just murder. It was the complete overthrow of American democracy, disguised as a constitutional crisis response. Questions? Harrison asked, looking around the briefing room at the assembled soldiers and operatives. Blackwood had 1,000 questions, but only one that mattered. How could he stop this without getting himself and Rodriguez killed in the process? Agent Harrison, Blackwood said carefully, what happens if there are complications? Unexpected variables that aren't covered in the plan? Harrison's smile was the coldest thing Blackwood had ever seen. Colonel, there won't be any complications. We've been planning this for 8 months, and we've eliminated every possible source of interference. Tomorrow, American democracy will be saved from a president who would have destroyed it. The twisted logic was perfect in its horror. Constitutional Reset genuinely believed they were saving democracy by destroying it, protecting the Constitution by violating it, and serving their country by committing treason against it. But as the briefing concluded and Blackwood was escorted to quarters where he would spend the night before tomorrow's operation, he realized that he had one advantage the conspiracy didn't know about. They had made the mistake of trusting him with complete knowledge of their plan, assuming that his military loyalty would override his constitutional oath. They had given him every detail he needed to stop them, but they had also put him in a position where any attempt to resist would result in immediate death. Colonel Marcus Blackwood had 18 hours to find a way to save the President of the United States, preserve American democracy, and keep himself and his men alive long enough to see justice done. The countdown to the assassination had begun, and somewhere in the White House the President was preparing for a speech that would either announce his policy agenda or become his final public appearance. At 0547 hours, 17 hours and 13 minutes before Constitutional Reset would attempt to assassinate the President of the United States, Colonel Marcus Blackwood made a decision that would either save American democracy or cost him everything he had spent 22 years building. He was going to betray every person who trusted him, violate every order he had been given, and risk the lives of everyone he cared about. He was going to honor his oath to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, even when those enemies wore the same uniform he did. But first, he had to find a way to contact someone outside the conspiracy without getting himself killed in the process. The quarters where Constitutional Reset had housed him overnight were in a secure facility 6 blocks from the Capitol, monitored by cameras and guarded by operatives who looked like former Special Operations soldiers. Rodriguez was in the room next door, separated by walls that were probably equipped with listening devices. Any attempt to communicate with his NCO would be detected immediately. But Blackwood had noticed something during the previous night's briefing that might give him the opportunity he needed. The facility's security was designed to keep people from getting in, not to keep people from getting out. Constitutional Reset was so confident in their psychological manipulation and operational control that they hadn't considered the possibility that someone might actually try to escape and warn authorities. That overconfidence was about to become their fatal mistake. At 600 hours, Blackwood requested permission to conduct his morning physical training routine, a request that any military facility would consider normal and harmless. The guard who escorted him to the facility's small gymnasium was professional, but not particularly alert. After all, what could one colonel do against an 8-month conspiracy involving hundreds of operatives? But what the guard didn't know was that Blackwood had spent the previous night memorizing every detail of the facility's layout, identifying security weaknesses, and planning an escape route that would get him to a secure communication point before Constitutional Reset realized he was gone. The gymnasium was on the building's 3rd floor, with windows that faced an alley behind the facility. More importantly, the windows were old-style casement windows that could be opened manually, something that modern secure facilities rarely included. Constitutional Reset had chosen their command center for its location and communication capabilities, but they hadn't updated its physical security to military standards. At 6:15 hours, while the guard waited outside the gymnasium door, Blackwood began what appeared to be a standard military workout routine. But instead of exercise, he was conducting a final reconnaissance of his escape route and preparing equipment he would need for what came next. The facility's fire suppression system included emergency axes mounted in glass cases throughout the building. The windows were reinforced but not bulletproof. The alley behind the building connected to a street that would take him directly to the FBI field office 6 blocks away. But the sound of helicopters approaching the facility would force him to accelerate his timeline. Through the gymnasium windows, Blackwood could see military helicopters landing on the building's roof. Constitutional Reset was bringing in additional personnel for the final phase of their operation, which meant they would soon discover that he knew too much to be trusted with operational details. He had minutes, not hours, before they decided to eliminate him as a security risk. At 06:22 hours, Colonel Marcus Blackwood broke the glass case containing the emergency fire axe, smashed the gymnasium window, and began his escape from a conspiracy that had taken 8 months to plan and 17 hours to execute. The 3-story drop into the alley should have been impossible to survive, but Blackwood had noticed that the building's fire escape ladder extended to within 8 feet of the gymnasium window. A desperate leap, a painful landing on metal rungs, and 30 seconds of controlled falling brought him to street level with nothing worse than bruised ribs and scraped hands. But as he reached the alley entrance, the sound of shouting from above told him that his escape had been discovered. "Security breach! Colonel Blackwood is not in his quarters! Initiate lockdown protocols immediately!" The voice belonged to Agent Harrison, and the urgency in his tone confirmed what Blackwood already knew. Constitutional Reset couldn't afford to let him reach outside authorities with what he knew about their operation. Running through the streets of Washington, D.C. at 6:25 hours, Blackwood realized that he was now being hunted by some of the most skilled operatives in the world. Former Special Operations soldiers, intelligence agents, and military contractors who had the resources and training to track down and eliminate a single target in an urban environment. But they had made one crucial mistake. They had underestimated what a Delta Force colonel would do when fighting for something bigger than his own survival. The FBI field office was 4 blocks away when Blackwood heard the sound of vehicles moving through the streets with obvious coordination. Constitutional Reset had deployed multiple teams to intercept him before he could reach federal law enforcement. They were using the same tactics they would have used to hunt enemy operatives in foreign countries, but they were using them against an American soldier in the capital of the United States. But as Blackwood turned onto Pennsylvania Avenue, he realized that his escape had created an opportunity he hadn't expected. Constitutional Reset's response to his escape was revealing their operational capabilities and personnel to anyone who was watching. Federal agencies that might not have known about the conspiracy were now seeing unmarked vehicles, armed operatives, and military-style coordination in downtown Washington, D.C. without any official authorization. His escape wasn't just an attempt to warn authorities about the assassination plot. It was forcing Constitutional Reset to expose themselves in ways that would make denial impossible. At 0631 hours, 6 blocks from the Capitol building where the president would arrive in 7 hours and 29 minutes, Colonel Blackwood reached the FBI field office and ran directly into the arms of federal agents who had been alerted by reports of unusual military activity in downtown Washington. "I'm Colonel Marcus Blackwood, United States Army Delta Force," he announced to the first agent he encountered. "I have information about an imminent threat to the President of the United States that requires immediate action at the highest levels of government." The agent's response would determine whether American democracy survived the next 7 hours. "Sir, I'm Agent Sarah Chen, FBI Counterintelligence Division," she replied, her training evident in the way she immediately assessed Blackwood's condition and credibility. "What kind of threat are we talking about?" "A military coup disguised as an assassination attempt," Blackwood said, the words sounding surreal even as he spoke them. "There's a conspiracy involving elements of the military, intelligence community, and defense contractors planning to kill the president during his arrival at the Capitol today." Agent Chen's expression shifted from professional skepticism to alarm as she processed what Blackwood was telling her. "Sir, I need you to come with me immediately. This information needs to reach the Director and the Secret Service within minutes." But as they moved toward the building's secure communication center, the sound of vehicles surrounding the FBI field office confirmed Blackwood's worst fears. Constitutional Reset had followed him here, and they were prepared to assault a federal facility to prevent him from exposing their operation. "Agent Chen," Blackwood said urgently, "the people outside this building are part of the conspiracy. They'll do anything to stop this information from reaching the Secret Service." Through the building's windows, they could see unmarked vehicles taking positions around the field office. Armed men in civilian clothes were deploying with military precision, establishing a perimeter that would prevent anyone from entering or leaving the building. Constitutional Reset was laying siege to an FBI facility in broad daylight, 6 hours before they planned to assassinate the President of the United States. "This is Agent Chen requesting immediate backup and communication with FBI headquarters," she said into her radio. "We have a credible threat against the President and hostile forces surrounding our facility." But the response that came back would reveal how deep Constitutional Reset's infiltration really went. "Agent Chen, this is Deputy Director Morrison. Stand down immediately and release the individual in your custody. This is a classified counterintelligence operation, and your interference is not authorized." The voice on the radio belonged to someone Blackwood recognized from the Pentagon briefing room. Constitutional Reset had infiltrated the FBI's leadership, and they were using that infiltration to prevent him from warning anyone about the assassination plot. Agent Chen looked at Blackwood with growing understanding. "Sir, how high does this conspiracy go?" "Higher than either of us imagined," Blackwood replied. "But there's still time to stop them if we can reach the right people." At 0647 hours, with Constitutional Reset operatives surrounding the FBI field office and corrupted officials trying to silence them through official channels, Agent Chen made a decision that would save the president's life. She activated an emergency protocol that bypassed normal FBI communication channels and sent a direct alert to the Secret Service Presidential Protection Detail, the Pentagon's Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the White House Situation Room simultaneously. The message was simple. Credible intelligence indicates imminent assassination attempt against POTUS during Capitol arrival. Recommend immediate route change and enhanced security protocols. Source: Colonel Marcus Blackwood, Delta Force, currently under hostile surveillance at FBI field office. Within minutes, the response came back from the White House Situation Room. Message received and confirmed. POTUS route changed. Secret Service implementing emergency protocols. Federal response teams en route to your location. But the sound of helicopters and sirens approaching from multiple directions would prove that Constitutional Reset wasn't going to surrender without a fight. At 0652 hours, as federal response teams surrounded the FBI field office and constitutional reset operatives found themselves trapped between the building they were besieging and the legitimate law enforcement officers closing in on them, the conspiracy that had taken 8 months to plan began to collapse in real time. The arrests were swift and comprehensive. General Crawford, Colonel Peters, Agent Harrison, and dozens of other conspirators were taken into custody before they could destroy evidence or eliminate witnesses. The scale model of the Capitol building, the tactical plans, and the communication records that detailed 8 months of treasonous planning were all seized as evidence. But the most important victory was the simplest one. At 1400 hours, when constitutional reset had planned to assassinate the President of the United States, he was safely in the White House, delivering his speech about military budget cuts via secure video link to a joint session of Congress. The conspiracy had failed, American democracy had survived, and the Constitution had been defended by a soldier who chose his oath over his orders. 3 months later, Colonel Marcus Blackwood stood in a federal courtroom and testified about everything he had witnessed, everything he had learned, and everything he had risked to stop constitutional reset. His testimony helped convict 47 conspirators on charges ranging from treason to conspiracy to commit murder. The military careers of everyone involved were over, but Blackwood realized that some things were more important than careers. Some oaths were more sacred than loyalty to individuals or institutions. Some principles were worth sacrificing everything to defend. As he walked out of that courtroom, Colonel Blackwood understood that he had fought the most important battle of his military career not on a foreign battlefield, but in the halls of the Pentagon, the streets of Washington, D.C., and the conscience of a soldier who refused to let his uniform become a costume for treason. The Constitution had survived, democracy had endured, and America remained a nation where soldiers swore their loyalty not to men or institutions, but to the principles that made their service meaningful. Sometimes the greatest act of military loyalty looks exactly like military rebellion. Colonel Marcus Blackwood had learned that lesson in the hardest way possible, but he had learned it in time to save the country he had sworn to protect.